There is clear evidence that the pages of the St. Petersburg portion had been colored, perhaps by coffee, to make them look older. And if you go online and look at them, you can see the streaks of the coloration, where the guy who did it was in a hurry, and he wasn't very careful, and you can see where, you use a paintbrush and you don't put it on evenly. You can see the streaks if you go on the internet and look for it. And so there is, number one, the personal testimony of Simonides. He said, I did it, and he produced eyewitnesses. Guy by the name of Callinicos, his uncle Benedict, and another scribe there at Mount Athos. Two, there is the physical evidence. It doesn't look old. It's been mutilated. The text flows around the wormholes and not the other way around. Back in 2011, the BBC, and of course they were aware that 2011 was the 400th anniversary of the King James Bible. So they went to the British Museum and did an interview there about Sinaiticus. I mean, it shows there, they didn't know what they're talking about. Sinaiticus has nothing to do with the King James Bible. But I don't think they knew that. But the point is this, with a camera running, and it used to be on the internet. I'm not sure if that clip is still up there on YouTube. But I've seen it. And that is, they pulled Sinaiticus off the shelf there in the library or the museum. And while the camera was running and the reporter was interviewing, the docent or the librarian there was flipping the pages like you'd flip it in an old telephone book. Folks, something that is 1,700 years old is not supple. It's stiff and fragile. In fact, when I was researching from this book, I wrote to the British Museum and requested if I could come over there and look at the document. Well, first they made me jump through a bunch of hoops. I had to produce recommendations from other scholars. Dr. Brown wrote a nice recommendation. And did you get in that also, Brother Stringer? Yeah, Brother Stringer did also. And so I sent those over there, and I told them my purpose. I'd like to come and examine Sinaiticus. They wrote me back. Well, first of all, they said, we consider it so fragile and so delicate and so old that we're not letting anybody look at it anymore. Of course, their own librarian was flipping through it like an old Sears catalog. Yeah, that's right. And at one point, but they said, we'll answer your questions. So I sent them a couple of questions, and then I wrote an email and said, you surely are aware that there's question about the antiquity of this. I mean, there's been a couple guys in England who have written on this. And surely you're aware that there's question about the age of Sinaiticus. Have you done any testing of the document? Take a small portion and do a carbon-14 test on it. Now, carbon-14 isn't any good for evolution. It's only good for 3,000 or 4,000 years. But it would tell us if that document was 150 years old or 1,500 years old. They wouldn't answer. Silence. Crickets. And either they had done it and they didn't want to admit it, or they didn't want to do it because they're afraid what they'd find out. So there was the personal testimony, there was the physical evidence. Number three, there is internal textual evidence. Years later, in the late 19th century, after Simonides was dead and the controversy had died down, but a man by the name of Sir James Donaldson, who was considered England's top literary expert of that era, did an analysis of Sinaiticus just from purely a literary point of view. And he said the words in portions of it were in modern Greek and not ancient, or we'd call it Koine Greek. It was in modern Greek, portions of it, some words. I mean, that's like reading Shakespeare and he's talking about his iPhone. I mean, that tells you something right there. This is not ancient. This was done relatively recently. When Dr. Dale Johnson read that, he said, that settled it for me. And so the collective evidence says to me that Sinaiticus is not old. And the whole premise of the critical text is we got to go to the oldest manuscripts to determine what is the Word of God.